Some losses cut so deep they change the shape of a man's heart forever. Jacob Winters knew this truth better than most, having buried his wife and daughter 20 years ago in the ashes of their burned homestead. Now he lived alone in the Wyoming mountains, far from the world that had taken everything from him. His cabin was his fortress, silence his only companion. He trusted no one and needed nothing except the wilderness that surrounded him. But on this cold morning, Jacob found a small girl stealing bread from his doorstep. She was dirty, scared, and alone. When he stepped outside, she looked up with wide eyes and whispered the words that would change both their lives forever. What had driven this child so far into the wilderness? And could two broken souls find healing in each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence had been Jacob's companion for so long that even the wind through the pines seemed like conversation. 20 years of mountain living had carved deep lines around his gray eyes and turned his once brown beard silver. But it wasn't the altitude or the harsh winters that had aged him most. It was the weight of memory, heavy as the snow that blanketed his world 6 months of every year. His cabin sat perched on a natural shelf of granite, surrounded by towering peaks that scraped the belly of the sky. The nearest neighbor was a 3-day ride through treacherous passes, and that was exactly how Jacob preferred it. He'd built this sanctuary with his own hands, each log cut and fitted with the precision of a man who understood that survival depended on getting every detail right. The morning routine never varied. Before dawn, he'd stoked the fire that had burned continuously for 2 decades, the embers never allowed to die completely. Coffee first strong enough to wake the dead, Emma used to say, then a survey of his domain from the cabin's covered porch. His eyes would sweep the tree line, noting the subtle changes that marked the passage of seasons, the movement of game, the approach of weather. In 20 years, nothing had surprised him. Until today, the bread should not have been there. Jacob stared at the loaf, or what remained of it, lying in the snow beside his woodpile. Fresh baked yesterday, it had been cooling on his kitchen windowsill when he'd retired. Now it lay violated, torn open with desperate hands, crumbs scattered like evidence of a crime. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle prop beside the door. Fingers closing around the familiar worn stock. Movement caught his eye. A flash of faded blue fabric behind the split logs. Jacob's breath steamed in the cold air as he stepped off the porch, boots crunching in snow that had fallen during the night. Each step was deliberate, practiced, the walk of a man who'd learned long ago that carelessness in the wilderness meant death. "Come out," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I know you're there." The rustling stopped. Then, slowly, a small figure emerged from behind the woodpile. Jacob's rifle lowered as his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. A child. A girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, wearing a dress that had once been blue but was now stained with mud, blood, and things he didn't want to identify. Her dark hair hung in tangled mats around a face smudged with dirt and marked by exhaustion. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They were too old for her face, filled with a terror so profound it seemed to reach across the space between them and clutch at his chest. In those eyes, Jacob saw something he recognized, the look of someone who had witnessed horrors that would haunt their dreams forever. The girl clutched the remaining bread to her chest like a shield, her small body trembling from more than just the cold. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, as fragile as frost on glass. "Sir, please don't hurt me." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. 20 years of carefully constructed walls cracked in an instant, and through the fissure came a flood of memories he'd spent decades trying to forget. Another little girl, with Emma's green eyes and his stubborn chin. who used to climb into his lap by this very fireplace and beg for stories about the world beyond their valley. Lucy. His Lucy, who would have been close to this child's age when Jacob forced the thought away, but the damage was done. His hands, steady enough to drop a buck at 200 yards, trembled as he leaned the rifle against the cabin wall. "Child," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, "where did you come from?" The girl's grip on the bread tightened. She looked ready to bolt at any moment, and Jacob realized that despite his size and the rifle, she was the one with the power here. Whatever had brought her to his doorstep had taken tremendous courage, the kind born of absolute desperation. He crouched down, making himself smaller, less threatening. The movement sent a twinge through his left knee, a souvenir from Gettysburg that the mountain cold never let him forget. "What's your name?" he asked, gentler this time. "Beatrice," she whispered. "Beatrice Harrison, but my mama called me B." The past tense didn't escape him. Jacob's jaw tightened as the implication settled over him like a familiar darkness. Another family destroyed, another child left alone in a world that had no mercy for the innocent. "Where's your mama now, B?" Fresh tears carved clean tracks through the dirt on her cheeks. "Gone. They're all gone." Jacob closed his eyes briefly, fighting the urge to gather this broken child into his arms. That way lay madness. He'd learned that lesson at too high a price. But when he opened his eyes and saw her standing there, shivering in her torn dress with stolen bread clutched to her chest, he knew his carefully ordered world was about to change forever. The wind picked up, carrying the promise of more snow. Jacob glanced at the sky, reading the signs written in the movement of clouds. A storm was coming, maybe the big one that would close the passes until spring. If he was going to get this child to safety, to people who could care for her properly, he had precious little time. But first, she needed warmth, food, and rest. Whatever had happened to her family, whatever horrors had driven her to his isolated cabin, could wait until she was strong enough to tell the story. "You hungry?" he asked. Bee nodded, not trusting her voice. "Well then, let's get you inside before we both freeze to death." Jacob stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. He'd learned long ago that sudden gestures could trigger responses in people who'd seen too much violence. The girl Bee watched him with the wariness of a wild thing, ready to flee at the first sign of threat. He turned toward the cabin, then paused. "That bread you took, it's yours now. No sense letting it go to waste." The simple words seemed to break something loose inside her. Fresh sobs shook her small frame, and Jacob felt the crack in his defenses widen further. He wanted to comfort her, but he'd forgotten how. 20 years of solitude had atrophied the muscles of compassion, left him clumsy with anything softer than survival. Inside the cabin, warmth enveloped them like an embrace. Jacob's home was sparse but well-made. Every stick of furniture crafted by his own hands. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened by decades of use. Simple wooden chairs sat before it, and in the corner, a bed built for one man who expected to die alone. Bee stood just inside the door, dripping melted snow onto the rough plank floor. She looked around with wide eyes, taking in the rifles mounted. On the walls, the animal pelts that served as rugs, the shelves lined with books that had kept Jacob company through countless lonely winters. "Sit by the fire," Jacob said, already moving toward the kitchen area. "I'll make you something hot." He busied himself with coffee and leftover stew, grateful for tasks that kept his hands occupied while his mind reeled. A child, after 20 years of isolation, a child had appeared at his door like something from a fever dream. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd come to these mountains to escape the responsibilities of the world, only to have the greatest responsibility of all thrust upon him as he worked. Jacob found himself stealing glances at Bee. She sat on the edge of the chair closest to the fire, still clutching the bread. her eyes darting around the room as if cataloging escape routes. She was thin, too thin, and bore the pallor of someone who'd been living rough for days, maybe weeks. The stew warmed, filling the cabin with rich aromas that made Bee's stomach growl audibly. Jacob ladled a generous portion into his best bowl, then hesitated. Emma's china was packed away somewhere, had been since the fire. This child deserved better than his rough wooden dishes, but it was all he had to offer. He set the bowl on a small table beside her chair, along with a cup of coffee heavily sweetened with precious sugar. Bee stared at the food as if it might disappear, then looked up at him with an expression that cut straight to his heart. "Thank you," she whispered. Jacob nodded gruffly and retreated to his own chair, pretending to busy himself with his own meal while watching her eat. She was careful with the food, each spoonful deliberate and small, as if she expected it to be taken away. It was the eating of someone who'd learned to make everything last, who'd gone hungry more often than not. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the shutters and sending snow swirling past the windows. Jacob's practiced eye read the signs. This was going to be a big storm, the kind that could bury the cabin to the eaves and close the mountain passes for weeks. The realization settled over him with the weight of inevitability. Whatever had brought this child to his door, wherever she belonged, she was his responsibility now. At least until spring opened the world again and he could figure out what to do with her. The thought terrified him more than any grizzly bear or mountain storm ever had. As if sensing his internal struggle, Bee looked up from her bowl. Her eyes, no longer quite so haunted with immediate hunger satisfied, held a wisdom that no child should possess. "I won't be any trouble," she said quietly. "I promise." Jacob's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her it wasn't about trouble, that his fear ran deeper than inconvenience. He wanted to explain about Lucy, about Emma, about the family photograph hidden in the bottom drawer of his dresser that he hadn't looked at in 5 years because the pain was still too sharp. Instead, he just nodded and stoked the fire, adding another log to the flames that would burn through the night, keeping them both warm while the storm raged outside, and two broken souls began the delicate work of learning to trust again. The storm arrived with the fury of something alive and angry, transforming Jacob's mountain sanctuary into an island in a sea of white. For 3 days, snow fell without mercy, piling against the cabin walls and burying the world under a blanket, so thick that even the wind couldn't penetrate its silence. On the 4th morning, when Bee had grown comfortable enough to speak in more than whispers, she told him about the blood. There was so much of it, she said, staring into the fire with those 2 old eyes. On the wagon canvas, on Papa's shirt, on the ground where Mama fell. Jacob's hand stilled on the leather he'd been working. In the days since her arrival, he'd pieced together fragments of her story. A wagon train heading west, some kind of attack, her family's death. But this was the first time she'd spoken of it directly, and her words carried the weight of witnessed horror. "Tell me what happened, child," he said gently. "All of it." Bee's small fingers worried the edge of a quilt. Emma had sewn before Lucy was born, one of the few feminine touches Jacob had been unable to pack away. She pulled a torn piece of calico from her dress pocket-faded blue fabric that might once have been cheerful. "This was from Mama's favorite dress," she said, holding the scrap like a talisman. "She was wearing it when they came." The story emerged, in fits and starts, interrupted by tears and long silences. The Harrison family had been part of a small, wagon train 5 families total heading for Oregon Territory, with dreams of fertile land and new beginnings. Bee's father, Thomas, had been carrying important papers and money, payment for territorial surveys that would help establish new settlements. They'd been camped in a box canyon, sheltered from an earlier storm, when the men arrived. Not Indians, as Jacob had initially assumed, but white men with hard eyes and harder hearts. They claimed to be travelers in need of help, and Thomas Harrison's good nature had been his undoing. Papa invited them to share our fire, Bee whispered. Mama made extra cornbread. They seemed so grateful. But gratitude had been a mask. When the families were asleep, the strangers had shown their true faces. They'd moved through the camp like wolves among sheep, taking lives with casual efficiency. Thomas Harrison had fought back, trying to protect his family, but he'd been a clerk, not a warrior. I was in the wagon when it started. Bee continued, her voice growing smaller. Mama told me to hide under the blankets when she heard the shouting. She came to check on me, and that's when one of them grabbed her. Jacob's jaw clenched as he imagined the scene. A mother's last moments spent trying to protect her child, dying within sight of the daughter she couldn't save. How did you get away? I stayed hidden, even when they searched the wagon. They took Papa's strongbox and Mama's jewelry, but they missed me under all the blankets. I waited until morning, until I was sure they were gone. For a child of 8 to survive alone in the wilderness for the weeks it must have taken to reach. Jacob's cabin spoke to a strength that humbled him. She'd followed game trails and creek beds, eating berries and roots, drinking from streams, guided by nothing but instinct and determination. My little brother Tommy didn't hide fast enough, she added. So quietly, Jacob almost missed it. He was only 5. The weight of that revelation settled over the cabin like a physical presence. Jacob found himself thinking of Lucy at 5, all laughter and curiosity, unable to imagine such innocence snuffed out by human cruelty. His hands clenched into fists, and for the first time in years, he felt the old familiar rage building in his chest. These men, he said carefully. Did you see their faces? Would you know them again? Bee nodded, then seemed to realize the implication of his question. Fear flickered across her features. You're not going to make me go back, are you? You're not going to tell them where I am. The desperation in her voice made Jacob's decision for him. Whatever plans he'd harbored about taking her to the nearest settlement, about finding proper authorities to care for her, evaporated like morning mist. This child had witnessed murder, and the men responsible were still out there. Until they were caught or dealt with, she wasn't safe anywhere. No, he said firmly. I won't tell anyone where you are. Relief flooded her features, followed immediately by exhaustion. The telling had cost her, and Jacob could see the weight of her ordeal settling over her like a shroud. But there was something else in her expression now, rust, tentative and fragile, but real. That evening, as the storm continued its assault on the world outside, Jacob found himself studying Bee as she dozed by the fire. She'd curled up in one of his chairs, still wearing her torn dress because she had nothing else. Her dark hair fell across her face, and in sleep, she looked even younger than her 8 years. A memory surfaced unbidden Lucy at that same age, falling asleep in that same chair after he'd read her stories from one of his books. The resemblance wasn't physical, but something in the curve of her shoulders, the way her hand tucked under her cheek, brought the past rushing back with painful clarity. Jacob stood abruptly, needing distance from the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. He moved to the window, peering out at the storm that had effectively trapped them together. The snow was still falling thick and heavy, and by his reckoning, it would be weeks before the passes were clear enough for travel. Weeks alone with a child who'd seen her family murdered. Weeks of being responsible for someone other than himself. The prospect should have terrified him, but instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years' purpose. When he turned back to the fire, Bee was awake, watching him with those careful eyes. Are you sorry I came here? She asked. The question caught him off guard. Jacob considered lying, offering some comfortable platitude about Christian duty and helping those in need. Instead, he found himself telling the truth. I don't know yet, he said. Ask me again come spring. It wasn't the reassurance she might have hoped for, but it was honest, and somehow that seemed to matter more to both of them than false comfort. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, piling snow higher against the windows and sealing them into their temporary world. Jacob added another log to the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker, casting warm light across Bee's sleeping face. 20 years ago, he'd lost everything that mattered to him. Now, fate had delivered another child to his door, another chance at the family he'd thought buried forever. The irony was sharp enough to cut. He'd spent 2 decades running from responsibility, only to have it find him in the most unexpected way. But as he watched Bee sleep, clutching that torn piece of her mother's dress like a lifeline to her lost past, Jacob felt something shift deep in his chest. It was small at first, just a crack in the armor he built around his heart. But it was enough to let in the faintest glimmer of something he'd thought dead forever. Hope. The storm raged on. But inside the cabin, 2 souls who'd lost everything began the slow, uncertain process of healing. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the mountains, the men who destroyed Bee's family continued their bloody work, unaware that their youngest victim had survived to tell the tale. Jacob's last thought before sleep claimed him was a prayer. He hadn't spoken in 20 years, not for salvation or forgiveness, but for the strength to protect what he'd been given. Because this time, he wouldn't fail. This time, he'd be ready when evil came calling. The fire burned low as the night deepened, but its warmth held steady, keeping watch over a mountain man who'd forgotten how to care and a little girl who'd remembered how to trust. The silence between them had weight now, different from the hollow emptiness Jacob had carried for 20 years. This was the companionable quiet of 2 people learning to share space, punctuated by small sounds that spoke of life continuing the pause. Whisper of pages turning when Bee looked through his books, a soft scrape of her spoon against the bowl during meals, the rustle of blankets when she shifted in her sleep by the fire. Jacob found himself hyper-aware of these sounds, each one a reminder that his carefully ordered solitude had been forever altered. Yet as the days passed, he discovered that the disruption wasn't entirely unwelcome. There was something almost musical about having another heartbeat in the cabin, another set of lungs drawing breath, another soul sharing the warmth of his fire. Bee moved through his home like a cautious ghost, touching nothing without permission, taking up as little space as possible. She watched him constantly with those careful dark eyes, studying his routines and moods with the intensity of someone whose survival depended on reading the signs correctly. The wariness in her every gesture broke something in Jacob's chest that he thought was beyond repair. On the 7th morning, while checking his traps in the pre-dawn darkness, Jacob made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days before. When he returned to the cabin, he found Bee already awake, sitting before the fire with her knees drawn up to her chest, staring into the flames with an expression far too old for her 8 years. "Come with me," he said simply. Bee looked up, uncertainty flickering across her features. "Where?" "The time you learned how things work up here." Jacob moved to his storage chest, the one that held remnants of a life he'd thought buried forever. "Can't have you just sitting around waiting for spring." His fingers found what they were looking for, buried beneath winter clothes and old books, wrapped carefully in soft deerskin that still smelled faintly of the tanning oils Emma had used. Jacob lifted the bundle with trembling hands, memories threatening to overwhelm him as he peeled back the protective layers. The wooden horse lay nestled in the deerskin like a sleeping animal. Pine wood worn smooth by loving hands, carved with the careful detail that had occupied Jacob through an entire winter 23 years ago. He'd worked on it by firelight while Emma hummed lullabies and mended clothes, planning for the Christmas that would be, Lucy's 6th, though she'd never lived to see it. Every detail was exactly as he remembered, the flowing mane he'd carved, strand by strand, the gentle arch of the neck, the delicate hooves that had taken him hours to get just right. Lucy had named it Thunder and carried it everywhere, even to bed. It had been clutched in her small hands when they found her body in the ruins of their home. Jacob should put it back. She'd wrap it carefully and pretend he'd never found it. The horse belonged to the past, to a little girl who would never grow older than 5. But as he looked at B Dirty, scared, alone in the world, he felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the chains he'd wrapped around his heart. "I made this for my daughter," he said quietly, his voice rougher than intended. "She would have wanted you to have it." Bee's eyes widened as Jacob placed the wooden horse in her small hands. She turned it over with reverent care, her fingers tracing the carved details as if she could read the love that had shaped them. "She's beautiful," Bee whispered, and Jacob felt his throat tighten at the wonder in her voice. "What was your daughter's name?" "Lucy." The name came easier than it had in years, as if speaking it aloud had somehow freed it from the locked vault of his memory. "She was about your age when I lost her." "How?" The simple question hung in the air between them, weighted with the grief of years. Jacob settled into his chair, staring into the fire as memories washed over him like tide returning to shore. "There was a fire," he began, the words coming slowly, painfully. "I was away fighting in the war, and raiders came to our valley. They burned everything, our house, the barn, the fields where we grew corn and wheat. My wife Emma and Lucy were trapped inside when the roof came down." Bee clutched the wooden horse to her chest, her eyes bright with understanding that cut straight through to Jacob's soul. "You weren't there to protect them." "No." The confession came out like a physical weight being lifted from his shoulders. "I was 1,000 miles away, fighting someone else's battles while my family died alone. Emma begged me not to enlist. Said the valley needed me more than the army did. But I was young and proud and convinced I knew what was right." They sat in silence for a long moment, the fire crackling between them, while outside the wind sang its eternal song through the mountain peaks. Finally, Bee spoke, her voice soft but carrying surprising strength. "It wasn't your fault." Jacob looked at her sharply. "How can you say that? I chose to leave them. I chose duty over family. My papa chose to help those men who came to our camp," Bee said with the simple wisdom of childhood. "He chose to be kind when maybe he should have been careful. But that doesn't make him responsible for what they did. Bad people make bad choices, and that's not the fault of good people who trust them." The truth in her words hit Jacob like a revelation. Here was a child who'd witnessed the worst of humanity, yet she still believed in the distinction between good and evil, still held on to the fundamental understanding that victims weren't responsible for their victimizers' choices. When had he forgotten something so basic? "Your papa sounds like he was a good man," Jacob said softly. "He was." Bee's smile was tinged with sadness, but warm with memory. "He used to say that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about doing what was right even when your hands were shaking." As the morning progressed, Jacob found himself teaching Bee the fundamentals of mountain survival with a patience that surprised him. He showed her how to read the sky for weather signs, how to identify animal tracks in the snow, how to build a fire that would burn efficiently through the night. "Why do we bank the coals like this?" he asked, watching as she carefully arranged the logs according to his instructions. "So the fire doesn't die while we sleep," Bee replied, her tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated. "And so we don't waste wood trying to restart it in the morning." "Good. What about this?" He pointed to the way she'd left gaps between the logs. "Airflow. Fire needs to breathe, just like we do." Jacob nodded approvingly. Bee was a quick learner, absorbing knowledge with the hunger of someone who understood that education might mean the difference between life and death. But more than that, she brought an enthusiasm to the lessons that Jacob hadn't felt in years, a sense that sharing his knowledge mattered, that passing on the skills he'd learned in 2 decades of mountain living had purpose beyond mere survival. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Bee surprised him by beginning to hum a soft, wordless melody that filled the cabin with something Jacob had almost forgotten existed. Music, the simple human expression of joy and comfort, and connection to beauty. "That's pretty," he said when she paused. "What is it?" "Something Mama used to sing while she worked," Bee replied, then continued humming as she played with the wooden horse, making it gallop through the air above her lap. "I'm going to call her Hope," she announced suddenly. "Hope? Because that's what she is." Bee looked up at Jacob with those two old eyes that somehow still held wonder. A gift from someone who loved his little girl very much, given to someone who needed to remember that good things can still happen. Jacob felt something fundamental crack open in his chest at those words. For 20 years, he'd carried his grief like armor, using it to justify his isolation and self-imposed exile from the world. But looking at this brave child who'd lost everything yet still chose to name a toy horse Hope, he began to understand that healing wasn't betrayal of the dead, was the deepest form of honoring them. "Hope it is," he said quietly, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Later that night, after Bee had fallen asleep in the chair by the fire with Hope clutched in her arms, Jacob sat watching her peaceful face and marveling at the change she'd brought to his world. The resemblance to Lucy wasn't physical. Bee's dark hair and olive skin bore no similarity to his daughter's blonde curls and fair complexion, but something in the way she tilted her head when thinking, the unconscious grace of her small hands, the absolute trust with which she'd accepted his care, brought the past rushing back not with pain but with a bittersweet recognition of love's continuity. This wasn't replacement or substitution, it was something entirely new. A second chance at the most important thing in life, offered by fate or providence or simple coincidence to a man who thought himself beyond redemption. As Jacob carried Bee to the makeshift bed he'd arranged for her near the fire, she stirred, just enough to whisper, "Thank you for Hope, and for letting me stay." "Thank you for coming," Jacob whispered back, and realized with startling clarity that he meant every word. Outside, the mountain wind continued its eternal conversation with the peaks, but inside the cabin, something new had taken root. Not just shelter from the storm, but the first tentative growth of what might, in time, become family again. 3 weeks into their shared existence, Bee's natural curiosity finally overcame her caution. Jacob came in from checking his traps to find her standing before his dresser, holding something that made his blood freeze in his veins, his medal. The bronze star he'd earned at Antietam when he dragged 3 wounded soldiers to safety under Confederate fire. He'd hidden it away with all the other reminders of his past, but somehow Bee had found it. "Were you a soldier?" she asked, her voice filled with something between awe and uncertainty. Jacob's first instinct was to take the medal away, to lock it back in its hiding place and change the subject. But the trust in Bee's eyes stopped him. She'd shared her darkest memories with him. Perhaps it was time to return the favor. "Yes," he said simply, settling into his chair. "During the war between the states." Bee climbed into the chair across from him, still holding the medal with careful reverence. "My papa said soldiers were heroes, that they fought to keep families safe. Some did." Jacob's voice carried a weight of old regret. "I thought I was. But while I was playing hero 1,000 miles from home, my family was dying." "Tell me about them," Bee said softly. "About Emma and Lucy?" The request caught Jacob unprepared. For 20 years, he'd avoided speaking their names, as if silence could somehow preserve them unchanged in his memory. But now, with this child, looking at him with such earnest attention, the words began to flow. "Emma had hair the color of autumn leaves," he began, his voice growing softer with remembrance. "She could make music from anything, humming while she cooked, singing while she worked in the garden. The house was always full of her voice. Like my mama," Bee said with understanding. "She sang while she sewed." Jacob nodded. "Lucy was 5. when she died, full of questions about everything: why the sky was blue, where the wind came from, how long it would take to count all the stars. She had this laugh that could fill a room, bright as church bells on Sunday morning. She sounds wonderful. She was. Jacob's throat tightened with old grief, but this time it felt less like drowning and more like rain after drought. I enlisted because I thought it was my duty, thought I was protecting our way of life. Emma begged me not to go, said the Valley. Needed me more than the army did. But I was young and foolish and convinced I knew better. Bee studied the medal in her hands, turning it over to read the inscription. What does this say? For valor beyond the call of duty, Jacob quoted. Meaningless words for a meaningless gesture. No. Bee's voice carried surprising firmness. You save people. That's not meaningless. I saved strangers while my family burned. You couldn't know what would happen at home. Papa always said, we can't live our lives afraid of what might be. We have to do what we think is right with the information we have. A father's wisdom, spoken through his daughter's voice, hit Jacob like a revelation. For 20 years, he'd tortured himself with what-ifs and might-have-beens, never considering that his choice to serve had been made with good intentions and incomplete knowledge. Your papa was a wise man, Jacob said quietly. He was scared sometimes, too, Bee admitted. When we left Missouri, Mama cried because she didn't want to leave her sister. Papa held her and said courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about doing what was right even when you were afraid. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Bee developed a fever. It started as a slight flush in her cheeks, but by midnight, she was burning with heat and shivering uncontrollably. Jacob found himself transported back 20 years, to Lucy's last illness, the helpless terror of watching a child suffer while being powerless to help. But this time was different. This time, he didn't freeze with paralysis. Instead, he moved. With purpose, drawing on skills learned from army medics and mountain necessity. Cool claws for her forehead, willow bark tea for the fever, careful monitoring through the long dark hours. Don't leave me, Bee whispered during one of her lucid moments, her small hand gripping his with surprising strength. I'm not going anywhere, Jacob promised, and meant it with every fiber of his being. He stayed beside her bed through the night, alternating between checking her temperature and singing half-remembered lullabies that Emma had once sung to Lucy. His voice was rough and unused to music. The Bee seemed to find comfort in the familiar melodies as dawn broke over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of golden rose. Bee's fever finally broke. She slept peacefully for the first time in hours, her breathing deep and even, color returning to her pale cheeks. Jacob slumped in his chair, exhausted but relieved beyond measure. When Bee woke later that morning, she found him still there, watching over her with red-rimmed eyes and stubbled cheeks. You stayed, she said wonderingly. I said I would. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding deeper than words. They weren't just sharing a cabin anymore. They were sharing a life, with all the responsibilities and fears and fierce protectiveness that came with caring for another person. Jacob? Bee's voice was small but clear. Yes? Am I your family now? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility and hope. Jacob looked at this brave little girl who'd survived horrors that would have broken grown men, who'd found the strength to trust again after losing everything she'd ever known. Would you like to be? Bee's smile was answer enough, but she nodded anyway, clutching the wooden horse, hope to her chest. Outside, the wind continued its eternal song through the peaks, but inside the cabin, something new had taken root. Not a replacement for what had been lost, but something entirely different, a chosen family born from shared grief and mutual need, tempered by the harsh beauty of the mountain winter. Jacob reached over and smoothed Bee's dark hair away from her forehead, marveling at how natural the gesture felt. 20 years of self-imposed exile were ending, not with fanfare or grand declarations, but with this simple moment of connection between two souls who'd found each other in the wilderness. "Rest now," he said gently. "I'll be right here." And, for the first time in 2 decades, Jacob Winters meant every word of a promise to protect someone he loved. January's grip on the mountains was absolute, transforming Jacob's world into a crystalline fortress of ice and snow. The storms came one after another, each more fierce than the last, sealing them so completely from the outside world that Jacob began to wonder if spring was just a memory from another life. But inside the cabin, warmth bloomed in ways that had nothing to do with the constantly burning fire. Bee had developed an insatiable curiosity about everything Jacob did, following him through his daily routines with the dedication of a devoted apprentice. She learned to read the weather by watching how he studied the sky, to judge the depth of snow by the way he tested each step, to identify animal tracks by their size and spacing. "Rabbit," she announced proudly one morning, pointing to a series of prints near the cabin. "See how the back feet land in front of the front feet?" Jacob nodded approvingly. "And how old are those tracks?" Bee crouched down, studying the edges of the prints with the intensity of a scholar. "The snow here is soft, but the tracks are still sharp. Maybe from last night? Good eye. What about those over there?" She followed his gesture to another set of prints, these partially filled with new snow. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she applied the lessons he'd taught her. "Older, maybe 2 days?" She looked up at him hopefully. "Close. 3 days, I'd say. See how the wind has started to round the edges." These lessons had become their morning ritual, Jacob's way of passing on knowledge that might someday save her life. But more than that, they were his way of sharing the skills that connected him to this land. He'd called home for so long. It was during one of these tracking exercises that Bee noticed the chain around Jacob's neck. He'd grown careless about hiding it, the constant presence of another person gradually wearing down his habits of concealment. When he knelt to examine deer tracks near the tree line, the chain slipped free from his shirt collar, catching the morning light. "What's that?" Bee asked with the directness of childhood. Jacob's hand moved instinctively to cover the chain, but it was too late. Her curiosity was already fully engaged, and he'd learned that trying to deflect Bee's questions only made her more determined to find answers. "Something that belonged to my wife," he said quietly. "Can I see it?" Jacob hesitated. Emma's wedding ring had been the one thing he'd managed to save from the fire, pulled from her finger before they buried her beside Lucy in the little cemetery behind their burned home. For 20 years, it had rested against his heart, a constant reminder of love lost and promises broken. But Bee was looking at him with such gentle interest, not the morbid curiosity of someone seeking drama, but the earnest attention of a child who understood that some treasures were sacred. Slowly, Jacob lifted the chain over his head. Emma's ring caught the light, the simple gold band gleaming despite its age. He placed it carefully in Bee's palm, watching as she examined it with reverent fingers. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Was she beautiful too? "The most beautiful woman in 3 counties, Jacob said, surprising himself with the ease of the words. At least, that's what everyone said. But to me, she was beautiful because of how she saw the world, always looking for the good in people, always believing things could be better than they were. Like Mama," Bee said softly. "She always said there was enough kindness in the world, if people would just choose to share it." Jacob nodded, understanding passing between them like a bridge across their shared grief. "Emma would have loved your mother. They both had hearts big enough to hold the whole world. Do you miss her?" "Emma?" The question should have been painful, but somehow, in this crystalline morning with snow sparkling like diamonds around them, it felt more like gentle acknowledgement of a truth long held in silence. "Every day," Jacob admitted. But it's different now than it used to be. How? Jacob considered the question, trying to put into words something he was only beginning to understand himself. Before, missing her felt like drowning. Now it feels more like carrying something precious that I want to keep safe. B nodded solemnly and handed the ring back to him. Mama used to say that love doesn't die just because people do. She said it changes shape, but it never really goes away. As Jacob slipped the chain back over his head, he felt the truth of those words settling into his bones. The love he'd carried for Emma and Lucy hadn't disappeared. It had been waiting, patient as the mountains themselves, for him to be ready to let it grow again. That afternoon brought a crisis that tested every skill Jacob had taught Bea and every bond they'd forged. She'd gone to check the snares he'd set near the cabin, a routine task she'd performed dozens of times. But when she didn't return within the expected time, Jacob felt familiar panic rising in his throat. He found her tracks easily enough. Small boot prints heading toward the eastern slope where he'd placed the rabbit snares. But somewhere along the way, the tracks diverged from their usual path, leading into a section of forest thick with deadfall and hidden ravines. "Bea," he called, his voice echoing off the mountain walls. "Bea, answer me." Nothing but the whisper of wind through snow-laden pines. Jacob forced himself to think like the tracker he'd trained her to be. Where would a curious 8-year-old go? What might have caught her attention enough to make her stray from the familiar path? The answer came to him with sudden clarity: animal tracks. Something large enough to intrigue her, heading in a direction she hadn't explored before. He found the wolf prints 50 yards from where her trail diverged. Massive paw marks pressed deep into the snow. Not threatening, just the passage of a lone wolf following its own mysterious agenda. But to Bea, they would have been irresistible, a puzzle to be solved with the tools Jacob had given her. Following the combined trail of wolf and child, Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs with each step. The terrain here was treacherous, riddled with hidden crevices and unstable snow that could give way without warning. One wrong step, one moment of carelessness. "Jacob!" The voice came from his left, thin and frightened. "Jacob, help me!" He found her 20 feet down a snow-covered slope, trapped in a depression between two fallen logs. She was unhurt but unable to climb out, the snow too deep and soft to provide stable footing. "I'm here," he called down to her, relief making his voice shake. "I'm going to get you out." The rescue took an hour of careful work lowering his belt for her to grab, finding secure anchor points, coaching her through each movement until she was safely back on solid ground. When she finally stood beside him, snow-covered and shivering but whole, Jacob pulled her into his arms with a fierceness that surprised them both. "Don't ever scare me like that again," he said into her hair. "I'm sorry," she whispered against his shoulder. "I just wanted to see where the wolf went." I know you did." Jacob held her at arm's length, studying her face to make sure she truly was unharmed. "But this mountain doesn't forgive mistakes, Bea, not even small ones." She nodded solemnly, understanding flooding her features. "I won't wander off again, I promise." As they walked back to the cabin together, Jacob realized something had shifted between them once again. The fear he'd felt at the thought of losing her had been immediate and overwhelming, cutting through 20 years of emotional numbness like a blade through silk. He cared about this child. More than cared. He loved her with the fierce protectiveness of a father, ready to move mountains or face down wolves to keep her safe. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, as they reached the cabin and he watched Bea hurry inside to warm herself by the fire, Jacob felt only gratitude for this unexpected gift a mountain had delivered to his door. February arrived with a false promise of spring, 3 days of warmer weather that set the ice to melting and filled the air with the sound of running water. Jacob knew it was temporary, just a brief respite before winter's final assault. But B greeted each day of sunshine with the joy of someone who'd learned not to take good moments for granted. It was during this warm spell that she presented him with her masterpiece. "I made something for you," she announced one morning, producing a carefully folded piece of paper from beneath her pillow. Jacob accepted the offering with the solemnity he'd learned such gifts required. When he unfolded it, his breath caught in his throat. Drawn in charcoal from the fireplace, the map showed their daily routines with startling accuracy. The path to the snares, the location of the woodpile, the creek where they drew water, even the spot where Jacob liked to sit and smoke his pipe in the evenings. But it was more than just a map. B had filled it with tiny details that spoke to her growing sense of home. A heart drawn beside the cabin, flowers sketched along the creek bank, even the rabbit tracks they'd studied together rendered in careful miniature. "It's our home," she said simply, as if that explained everything. Our home. The words hit Jacob like a physical blow, highlighting a reality he'd been trying not to acknowledge. This wasn't a temporary arrangement anymore. Wasn't just shelter until spring arrived. And he could figure out what to do with her. Somewhere in the long winter months, this had become exactly what B said it was: home. Their home. "It's beautiful," he said, and meant it. "You've got quite an eye for detail." B beamed with pride, but then her expression grew more serious. "Jacob, what happens when the snow melts?" The question he'd been dreading, spoken with the directness of childhood. Jacob folded the map carefully, buying himself time to think. What did happen when spring came? When the passes opened and the outside world became accessible again? "What would you like to happen?" he asked. "I want to stay here, with you." Her voice was small but determined. Would that be all right?" Jacob looked at this brave little girl who'd survived horrors that would have broken grown men, who'd somehow found the strength to make a new life from the ashes of her old one. The answer should have been complicated, should have involved discussions of legal guardianship and proper schooling, and what society expected of a single man raising a child. Instead, it was simple. "I'd like that too," he said quietly. "More than I can say." Relief flooded B's features, followed immediately by a smile that could have powered the sun. She threw her arms around his neck with an enthusiasm that nearly knocked him from his chair, and Jacob found himself laughing for the first time in 20 years. But even as they celebrated their mutual decision, Jacob's practical mind was already working through the implications. Come spring, there would be questions to answer, officials to satisfy, a little girl's legal status to secure. He'd need to make trips to town, interact with people he'd avoided for 2 decades, submit to scrutiny from authorities who might not understand their unconventional family. The thought filled him with dread, but it was dread mixed with fierce determination. Whatever it took, whoever he had to convince, B was staying. She was his daughter now in every way that mattered, and he'd fight heaven and hell to keep her safe. 3 days later, the false spring ended with typical mountain violence. A new storm roared down from the north, bringing with it temperatures that made previous cold spells seem balmy. Ice formed on the inside of the windows despite the roaring fire, and Jacob had to break a path through drifted snow just to reach his woodpile. It was during this brutal cold snap that their first visitor arrived. Jacob heard the horse before. He saw it, the labored breathing of an animal pushed too hard in dangerous conditions. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the frost-covered glass, and felt his blood turn to ice water. A lone rider sat his mount at the tree line, studying the cabin with obvious interest. Even at a distance, Jacob could see the man was well-armed and comfortable in the saddle, someone accustomed to traveling hard country in harsh weather. "B," Jacob called softly, his voice carrying an urgency that brought her immediately to his side. "I need you to go to the back room and hide under the bed. Don't come out until I tell you, no matter what you hear." Fear flickered across her features, but she nodded and moved quickly toward the bedroom. Jacob waited until he heard the soft sound of her hiding before checking his weapons. His rifle was loaded and ready, a revolver tucked into his belt, and years of survival instincts suddenly sharp as winter steel. The knock on his door came exactly as he'd expected, confident, unhurried, the knock of a man who believed he held all the advantages. "Hello, the cabin," a voice called. "Looking for shelter from this storm." Jacob moved to the door, but didn't open it. "Storm's dangerous for traveling. Maybe you should have thought of that before you started out." A laugh carried through the wooden barrier, cold as the wind. "Fair point, friend. Name's Morrison. I'm tracking some folks who went missing from a wagon train last fall. Heard there might be a survivor up this way." Jacob's grip tightened on his rifle. This was no coincidence, no chance encounter. Somehow, word of B's presence had leaked out, and now they'd come calling. "Can't help you," Jacob said. "Haven't seen anyone since the snow started falling. Mind if I come in? Awful cold out here, and my horse could use some rest." "I mind. This is private property, and you're not welcome." Another laugh, this one with an edge that raised the hair on Jacob's neck. "That's not very neighborly, friend. All I'm asking for is a little hospitality. I'm asking you to move." A long silence stretched between them, heavy with threat and possibility. Jacob could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge, could sense the man outside weighing his options and finding them all unpleasant. "You know," Morrison said finally, "I could have sworn I saw smoke from 2 fires when I was riding up." "Funny thing about smoke, it tells stories about how many people are keeping warm." Jacob's blood chilled. Had he been careless? Left evidence that more than one person lived in the cabin? Or was this just a bluff, a fishing expedition hoping to provoke a reaction? "Smoke plays tricks in mountain air," Jacob said evenly. "Especially in weather like this." "Maybe so." Morrison's voice was moving now, circling the cabin. "But I've got all day to figure it out. Storm like this, a man could get snowed in for weeks if he wasn't careful." The threat was clear. Jacob moved to the window, watching as Morrison dismounted and led his horse toward the lean-to where Jacob kept his own animals. The man was making himself at home, settling in for what might be a very long siege. From the back room came the faintest sound, B shifting position under the bed. Jacob prayed Morrison hadn't heard it, prayed that whatever game they were about to play, he'd be skilled enough to keep his daughter safe, because that's what she was now. He realized with crystal clarity. Not a responsibility or a burden or a temporary arrangement, but his daughter, his family. And he'd die before he let anyone take her from him. Outside, Morrison began to whistle, a cheerful tune that somehow sounded like a funeral dirge in the howling wind. Jacob settled in to wait, his finger on the trigger of his rifle, ready for whatever came next. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, a different kind of tempest was brewing, one that would test every skill Jacob had learned in 20 years of mountain survival and determine whether their newfound family would survive its first real threat. The standoff lasted 3 hours. Morrison made no attempt to force entry, instead to make his presence known through small sounds, the scrape of his boots on the porch, the occasional murmur to his horse, the deliberate rustle as he moved around the cabin's perimeter. Jacob tracked each movement through the windows, rifle ready, while B remained hidden in the back room with the patience of someone who'd learned that survival sometimes meant perfect stillness. When Morrison finally knocked again, his voice carried a different tone, less threatening, more reasonable. "Listen, friend, I think we got off on the wrong foot here. How about I just ask my questions and move along? No need for this to get unpleasant." Jacob said nothing, but his silence seemed to encourage Morrison to continue. "I'm looking for a little girl, 8 or 9 years old. Last survivor of a wagon train that got hit by raiders last fall. Family name was Harrison. You know anything about that?" The casual mention of B's family name sent ice through Jacob's veins. This wasn't some random search. Morrison knew exactly who he was looking for. Like I said, I haven't seen anyone. Thing is, Morrison continued, we know she made it out of that canyon alive. Found her tracks leading north into the mountains. Been following that trail for weeks now, and it led me right to your door. Jacob's mind raced. If Morrison had really been tracking Bay since fall, why wait until now to come calling? And more importantly, who was we? Seems like a lot of trouble. For one lost child, Jacob said carefully. Morrison's laugh held genuine amusement. Well, that's the thing about this particular child. See, she witnessed something she shouldn't have. Something that could cause problems for certain people if she ever decided to talk about it. The truth hit Jacob like a physical blow. Morrison wasn't here to rescue B. He was here to silence her. Permanently. Don't know what you're talking about, Jacob said, but his voice carried less conviction than before. Come now, friend. Number. Point in playing games. We both know she's in there. Morrison's voice moved closer to the door. Little girl like that, surviving alone in the mountains for months. That's not possible unless someone's been taking care of her. From the back room came the faintest sound, a suppressed sob that cut through Jacob like a knife. B had heard everything, understood the true nature of their visitor. Here's what's going to happen, Morrison continued. You're going to open this door and hand over the girl. In return, I'll make sure her death is quick and painless. Fight me on this, and I guarantee it'll go hard for both of you. Jacob felt something fundamental shift inside him. 20 years of accumulated grief and guilt transforming into cold, deadly purpose. This man had come to his home, threatened his daughter, and spoke of her murder as casually as discussing the weather. Tell me something, Morrison, Jacob said, moving away from the door toward his gun cabinet. You part of the group that killed her family? A pause. Then Morrison's voice carried what sounded like genuine pride. Guilty as charged, though I wasn't the one who pulled the trigger on her daddy. That honor belonged to my partner, Crawford. But I did take care of the woman, pretty little thing. Fought like a wildcat when she saw what was happening to her husband. Jacob's vision went red around the edges. The casual cruelty in Morrison's voice. The way he spoke of murdering innocent people, as if recounting a successful business transaction, ignited something primal and deadly in Jacob's chest. What about the boy? The 5-year-old? Crawford again. Kid tried to run, but there's nowhere to hide in a box canyon. Morrison chuckled. Probably should have checked that wagon more thoroughly, though. Might have saved us all this trouble if we'd found the girl then. Jacob reached his gun cabinet and began loading additional weapons with methodical precision. His hands were steady despite the rage burning through him, or perhaps because of it. This was familiar territory, the cold calculation of a soldier preparing for battle. You mind me asking what was so important about that wagon train? Jacob asked, buying time while he armed himself. Seems like a lot of killing for whatever a family of settlers might be carrying. Oh, it wasn't just any family. Morrison's voice carried satisfaction at having an audience for his story. Thomas Harrison was carrying territorial survey money, $20,000 in government gold. Payment for mapping the new Oregon settlements. We'd been tracking that shipment for weeks, waiting for the right opportunity. $20,000. Jacob whistled low. It was a fortune, enough to set up any man for life. But something about Morrison's tone suggested there was more to the story. That's a lot of money for a few men to split, Jacob said. Well, that's where it gets interesting. Morrison seemed to be enjoying himself now, clearly believing he held all the advantages. See, we're not just a few random thieves. We're part of something bigger. An organization that's been working these territories for years. Wagon trains, mining camps, settlements. We take what we want and leave no witnesses. The scope of what Morrison was describing made Jacob's blood run cold. Not random violence, but systematic predation on innocent families seeking new lives. In the territories, how many? Jacob asked quietly. How many what? How many families have you killed? Morrison was quiet for a moment, apparently counting. Including the Harrisons? Probably 15, maybe 20 wagon trains over the past 3 years. Hard to keep exact track. They all start to blur together after a while. Jacob closed his eyes, imagining the scope of that carnage. Dozens of families, hundreds of innocent people, murdered for nothing more than the contents of their wagons. Children like B, left orphaned or worse. The girl, Jacob said, his voice deadly calm. She's the only witness to survive? The only. One who matters. There have been a few others over the years, but most don't last long in the wilderness. This little Harrison girl, though she's proved surprisingly resourceful, almost makes me sorry I have to kill her. From the back room came another suppressed sob, and Jacob felt his last restraint snap like an overstretched rope. Morrison, he said quietly, yeah? You made one mistake coming here. What's that? Jacob moved to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains to locate his target. Morrison stood near the horse lean-to, confident and relaxed, obviously believing himself in complete control of the situation. You told me who you really are, Jacob said, and what you've done. He raised his rifle, sighting carefully through the window. 20 years of mountain hunting had kept his skills sharp, and Morrison was an easy target at 50 yards. But as Jacob's finger tightened on the trigger, Morrison pulled something from his saddlebags that made Jacob freeze. A pocket watch. Gold with an elaborate chain, catching the dim light as Morrison held it up where Jacob could see it. Recognize this? Morrison called. Belonged to Thomas Harrison. Had it made special in St. Louis, the inscription on the back? Even. At this distance, Jacob could make out words engraved on the watch's surface. His blood turned to ice as their implication became clear. To Thomas, with love and pride, Governor Whitman, Morrison read aloud. See, Thomas Harrison wasn't just carrying survey money. He was the governor's personal representative, carrying documents that would establish new territorial boundaries. That's information certain people would pay handsomely to obtain. Jacob's mind reeled as the true scope of the conspiracy became clear. This wasn't just about robbery. It was about territorial politics, about controlling the expansion of federal authority into the western lands. Morrison and his organization weren't simple bandits. They were tools in a much larger game. The girl saw those documents, Morrison continued. Heard conversations between her father and our employer before. We killed him. That makes her more than just a witness to murder. She's a threat to some very powerful people back east. What people? Jacob demanded. The kind who have enough money and influence to organize something like this. The kind who don't tolerate loose ends. Morrison's voice carried grim certainty. Even if you kill me today, they'll just send someone else. And someone after that. They'll never stop hunting her, because they can't afford to let her live. The implications hit Jacob like an avalanche. Even if he eliminated Morrison, even if he kept B hidden through the winter, there would always be another threat. She would never be truly safe as long as these mysterious employers knew she existed. But here's the thing, Morrison continued, his voice taking on a wheedling tone. It doesn't have to end badly for you. My employers, they're reasonable people. They understand that sometimes witnesses need to be relocated rather than eliminated. Give me the girl, and I guarantee you'll be well compensated for your trouble. Enough money to start over anywhere you want. Jacob stared at the pocket watch, his mind working furiously. Morrison thought he was offering a bribe, but he'd actually provided something far more valuable proof. Evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy if it fell into the right hands. How about this? Jacob said finally. You put down that watch and your weapons, and I'll consider your offer." Morrison laughed. "I wasn't born yesterday, mountain man." "Nice try, though. Then I guess we're at an impasse." "Not really." Morrison's voice hardened again. "See, I brought insurance." He gestured toward the tree line, and Jacob's heart sank as two more riders emerged from the forest. They'd been positioned as backup, probably watching the cabin for hours while Morrison conducted his negotiations. "Like I said," Morrison called cheerfully, "my employers don't tolerate loose ends. One way or another, that girl is dying today. Question is whether you're smart enough to take the money and walk away." Jacob looked toward the back room where B was hiding, then at the three armed men now surrounding his cabin. The odds were terrible, the situation seemingly hopeless. But as he checked his weapons one final time, Jacob felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years. The cold certainty of a soldier preparing for his last battle. These men had murdered B's family, killed dozens of other innocent people, and now they'd come to finish what they'd started. They'd chosen the wrong mountain to climb. "Morrison," Jacob called out. "Yeah? Thanks for the confession. It'll make explaining your death a lot easier." The time for talk was over. The real battle was about to begin. The cabin fell silent, except for the howling wind and the steady crackle of the fire. Jacob counted heartbeats, measuring the distance between himself and his hidden weapons cache, calculating angles and cover positions with the instinctive precision of a soldier who'd survived too many battles to count. 20 years of mountain peace were about to end in violence. But this time, unlike the night his family died, he was here to fight. "B," he called softly toward the back room. "Can you hear me?" "Yes," came her whispered reply. "Remember what I taught you about the emergency plan?" They'd practiced it dozens of times during the long winter evenings, though Jacob had hoped never to use it. If danger ever came to the cabin, B was to slip out through the loose floorboard in the back room, crawl under the cabin to the root cellar entrance, and hide there until Jacob came for her or until dawn, whichever came first. "I remember. Good. Girl, I need you to go there now, and I need you to take this with you." Jacob moved quietly to his dresser, retrieving a carefully wrapped bundle from the bottom drawer. Inside was a letter he'd written weeks ago, explaining B's situation and his own identity, along with instructions for what to do if something happened to him. He slipped the bundle through the gap between the wallboards that separated the main cabin from the back room. "If I don't come for you by sunrise, you take this to the territorial marshal in Red Creek. Tell him everything that happened here. Jacob, no arguments, daughter. This is how we keep you safe." The endearment slipped out naturally, and Jacob heard B's sharp intake of breath. In all their weeks together, he'd never called her that directly, though the truth of it had been growing in his heart like a steady flame. "I love you too," she whispered, understanding flowing between them without need for more words. Jacob closed his eyes briefly, drawing strength from that simple declaration. Then he moved to the gun cabinet he'd built into the cabin's back wall. Hidden behind a false panel that looked like ordinary shelving, inside were the tools of his former trade weapons. He'd hoped never to touch again, but had kept maintained out of mountain necessity. A Spencer repeating rifle, cleaned and oiled. 2 Navy Colt revolvers with custom grips. A shotgun with barrels sawed short for close work. Ammunition enough for a small war. But more than weapons, the cache contained something else. His old uniform jacket, the one he'd worn at Antietam and Gettysburg, with sergeant's stripes still sewn to the sleeves. Jacob hadn't put it on in 20 years, but now he shrugged into it with grim purpose. If he was going to fight his last battle, he'd do it as the soldier he'd once been. Outside, Morrison was organizing his men with the confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. Jacob could hear their voices carrying on the wind, making plans, dividing responsibilities. They thought they were dealing with a simple mountain hermit, someone who could be intimidated or overwhelmed through superior numbers. They were about to learn otherwise. Jacob moved through the cabin like a man preparing for a siege, which in many ways he was. Extra ammunition distributed to strategic positions. Water barrels moved to provide additional cover. Furniture repositioned to create firing positions while protecting vital areas. From under the cabin came the soft sounds of B following their escape plan. Jacob listened until he heard the muffled thump of the root cellar door closing, then allowed himself a moment of relief. Whatever happened next, she was as safe as he could make her. "You about done in there?" Morrison called. "Getting awful cold out here, and my patience is wearing thin." Jacob checked his weapons one final time, then moved to the front window. Morrison and one of his men had taken cover behind the horse lean-to, while the third rider had circled around to watch the cabin's backside. Professional positioning, though they'd made one crucial error. They'd underestimated the terrain. Jacob had chosen this spot for his cabin with defense in mind, though he told himself at the time it was just good sense for someone living alone in dangerous country. The cabin sat on a natural rock shelf with limited approaches, commanding a clear view of the surrounding area. Most importantly, it backed up against a cliff face that provided absolute security from that direction. What Morrison couldn't know was that the cliff contained a hidden cave system Jacob had discovered years ago, with an entrance concealed behind the cabin's foundation. If things went badly, he had an escape route his enemies couldn't predict or follow. But Jacob had no intention of running. These men had murdered innocents, threatened his daughter, and brought violence to his sanctuary. They'd chosen this fight, and now they were going to finish it. "Morrison," he called out, "one last chance to ride away." "Can't do that, mountain man." "Orders are orders. Then you chose this." Jacob raised his rifle and put a bullet through the lean-to support post, sending the structure's roof crashing down onto Morrison's position. The shot echoed across the mountains like thunder, and the battle was joined. Morrison's men reacted with trained efficiency, returning fire from multiple positions while their leader extricated himself from the collapsed shelter. Bullets spanged off the cabin's log walls and shattered the front window, filling the air with splinters and the sharp crack of gunfire. But Jacob had the advantage of prepared positions and superior cover. He moved from window to window, picking his shots carefully, making every bullet count. The Spencer rifle's magazine gave him rapid follow-up shots, and his years of hunting had kept his marksmanship sharp. The man watching the cabin's rear exposed himself, trying to get a better angle, and Jacob's bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him tumbling into a snowdrift. Not a killing shot, but enough to remove him from the immediate fight. "Damn it, Crawford," Morrison shouted. "I thought you said this was just some hermit." Crawford, the name B had mentioned, the man who'd killed her little brother. Jacob's jaw tightened as he acquired his next target. Some crimes demanded personal justice. The battle settled into a deadly pattern of movement and counter-movement, each side trying to gain advantage through position and timing. Morrison's men had numbers and mobility, but Jacob had intimate knowledge of every rock and tree around his cabin, every angle of cover and concealment. As the afternoon wore on, Jacob began to implement a plan that had been forming in his mind since the moment Morrison revealed his true intentions. He couldn't just win this fight. He had to end it completely. As long as any of these men survived to report B's location, she would never be safe. That meant taking the fight to them. Jacob slipped out the cabin's back door during a lull in the firing, using the cliff face and scattered boulders for cover. As he worked his way around Morrison's position, the snow helped muffle his movements, and his dark clothing made him nearly invisible against the gray rock. He was halfway to his objective when Morrison spotted him. "There, he's moving around the east side." Gunfire erupted again, bullets whining off rocks and kicking up sprays of snow around Jacob's position. But he kept moving, driven by purpose and the cold certainty that this was his only chance to end the threat permanently. Crawford tried to intercept him, emerging from behind a fallen tree with his rifle raised. But the man was wounded and slow, and Jacob's shot took him center mass before he could fire. Crawford spun and fell, and didn't get up again. One down. Morrison's remaining partner tried to flank Jacob from the opposite direction, but he'd misjudged the terrain. His route took him across an open slope where Jacob had a clear shot from his elevated position. 2 down. That left Morrison himself, and Jacob could hear the man moving through the trees, hunting him with the persistence of someone who knew retreat wasn't an option. This was personal now, a duel between 2 men who understood that only one would leave this mountain alive. Jacob found Morrison's position by following his tracks in the snow. But when he arrived, the spot was empty except for a message scratched into the bark of a pine tree. "The girl dies today." Behind Jacob, a twig snapped. He spun around to find Morrison 20 feet away, rifle raised and aimed directly at his chest. The man's face was flushed with cold and exertion, but his hands were steady. "Should have taken the money, mountain man," Morrison said. "Now you're both going to die." Jacob stared down the barrel of Morrison's rifle, calculating distances and angles, knowing he was a split second away from death. But instead of fear, he felt only a strange sense of completion. He'd found his family again, loved again, chosen to protect something precious again. This time, he wouldn't fail. "Maybe," Jacob said quietly, "but you'll never hurt another child." Morrison's finger tightened on the trigger, and Jacob prepared to make his last play, a desperate gamble that would determine whether evil or justice prevailed on this frozen mountain. The wind held its breath, and for a moment, the world balanced on the edge of a knife. Time slowed to a crystalline moment of perfect clarity. Jacob could see Morrison's finger beginning to squeeze the trigger, could read the cold satisfaction in the man's eyes, could feel death approaching with the inevitability of avalanche. But 20 years of mountain living had taught Jacob patience, and 30 years before that, war had taught him timing. As Morrison's rifle began to buck with recoil, Jacob threw himself sideways behind the massive trunk of a fallen pine. The bullet meant for his heart instead splintered bark inches from his head, filling the air with wooden shrapnel. Jacob rolled, came up firing, and put 2 quick shots into the tree Morrison was using for cover. The killer dove for better protection, giving Jacob the precious seconds he needed to reach his own objective. Rocky outcrop that provided clear fields of fire in multiple directions. "Getting tired yet, old man?" Morrison called out, his voice carrying false bravado. "This mountain's going to be your grave." Jacob didn't waste breath on replies. Instead, he studied the terrain with the tactical eye of a soldier, reading the dose. Story written in tracks and disturbed snow. Morrison was moving in a wide circle, trying to get behind him. But the man didn't understand mountain warfare the way Jacob did. Every stone and tree on this slope was familiar to Jacob, mapped in his memory from decades of hunting and exploring. He knew where the hidden ravines waited to trap unwary feet, where loose rock could betray a man's position, where the wind carried sound and where it died in sheltered pockets. Morrison, for all his skill as a killer, was fighting on Jacob's ground now. Jacob caught a glimpse of movement 50 yards to his left, a flash of brown coat against white snow. He raised his rifle, led the target slightly, and fired. Morrison's curse echoed across the mountainside as the bullet forced him to abandon his position. "You're just delaying the inevitable," Morrison shouted. "I've got all day, and you're outnumbered." But Jacob could hear the lie in Morrison's voice. The man was alone now, his partners dead in the snow, and the approaching darkness would favor the defender who knew every inch of this terrain. A new sound reached Jacob's ears, the distant tinkling of metal against metal. He smiled grimly as he recognized it. B, hidden in the root cellar, was following their emergency plan perfectly. The small signal mirror he'd given her was catching the last rays of sunlight, sending coded flashes that told him she was safe and in position. But the signal also told him something else. From her hiding place, Bee had a clear view of the eastern slope, the route Morrison was most likely to use for his final approach. If Jacob could maneuver the killer into that killing ground, Bee could provide warning of his movement. Jacob began to move, using fire and movement tactics burned into his muscle memory from a dozen Civil War battlefields. He'd fire from one position, then immediately relocate before Morrison could return accurate fire. Each shot was aimed not just to kill, but to herd Morrison toward the eastern slope where Jacob wanted him. The plan worked. Morrison, frustrated by his inability to pin down his quarry, began taking greater risks to close the distance. He broke cover more frequently, moved faster through open ground, made the kind of mistakes that got men killed in warfare. Jacob was repositioning for what he hoped would be a finishing shot when disaster struck. His boot found a patch of ice hidden beneath fresh snow, and his legs went out from under him. He tumbled down a short slope, his rifle flying from his hands to land in a drift 20 feet away. Morrison's triumphant yell echoed across the mountains. "Got you now, you old bastard!" Jacob rolled to his feet, drawing one of his revolvers, but Morrison was already in motion. The killer burst from cover like a man possessed, rifle raised, closing the distance with deadly purpose. 20 feet. Jacob's first shot missed, the revolver's shorter barrel less accurate at distance than his rifle. 15 feet. Morrison's return shot scored the ground beside Jacob's feet, close enough to spray him with snow and frozen earth. 10 feet. Jacob's second shot hit Morrison in the leg, staggering him but not stopping his charge. 5 feet. Morrison raised his rifle like a club, his face twisted with rage and pain, close enough now that Jacob could see the madness in his eyes. That's when the signal mirror flashed again. Not the coded message of safety, but a desperate warning. Bee had seen something Jacob couldn't. Morrison's wounded partner Crawford, not dead as Jacob had believed, crawling through the snow with a pistol in his hands. Jacob spun around just as Crawford fired. The bullet meant for Jacob's back instead caught Morrison in the chest as the killer lunged forward. Morrison's eyes went wide with shock and betrayal as he realized his own partner had shot him. "Crawford, you fool," Morrison gasped, blood frothing from his lips. "Sorry, boss," Crawford wheezed from where he lay in the snow. "But they're paying me more to make sure there are no witnesses, including you." Jacob stared in amazement as the conspiracy ate itself alive, greed and paranoia turning allies into enemies. But his relief was short-lived as Crawford's pistol swung toward him. "Nothing personal, Mountain Man," Crawford said. "Just business." The shot echoed across the mountains, final and absolute. But it wasn't Crawford who fired. The shot came from behind Jacob, and Crawford's expression of cruel satisfaction transformed into shock as the bullet found its mark. The wounded killer's pistol fell from nerveless fingers as he toppled backward into the snow, his eyes staring sightlessly at the darkening sky. Jacob spun around to see a small figure emerging from the tree line, holding his shotgun with determined hands despite its weight. Bee's face was pale but resolute, her jaw set with the same stubborn courage that had carried her through the wilderness alone. "I followed the plan," she said simply. "But when I saw him about to shoot you, I couldn't just hide." Jacob stared at his daughter, for that's what she was. He realized, in every way that mattered, and felt pride and terror war in his chest. She'd saved his life, but in doing so, she'd taken one. That weight would stay with her forever, a burden no child should have to carry. "Bee, I know what I did," she said quietly, setting the shotgun carefully aside. "And I know it was necessary." They were evil men who hurt innocent people. From somewhere in the scattered snow came a wet, gasping sound. Morrison was still alive, blood spreading dark against the white ground. but his eyes held the clarity of a man who knew death was coming. The girl, he wheezed as Jacob approached, she'll never be safe. Too many people know about her now. Too much money at stake. Jacob knelt beside the dying man, his revolver ready but lowered. Who's paying? You? Who's behind all this? Morrison's laugh turned into a coughing fit that brought up more blood. You think knowing names will help? This goes all the way to Washington, old man. Senators, territorial governors, mining interests. They've got too much invested in controlling Western expansion to let one little girl bring it all down. Then we'll have to make sure they understand the cost of coming after her, Jacob said grimly. You can't fight them all, Morrison gasped. They'll keep coming. Different faces, but they'll keep coming until she's dead. Jacob looked at Bea, who had moved closer despite the gruesome scene. Her face was pale but determined, and he could see her mother's strength in the set of her shoulders, her father's courage in the lift of her chin. Maybe, Jacob said quietly, but we're not running. This is our home, and anyone who wants to take her will have to go through me. Morrison's eyes were growing glassy, but he managed one final sneer. Noble sentiment. Won't matter when they send a dozen men instead of 3. Then I guess I'll need to get better at killing, Jacob replied. Morrison tried to respond, but death claimed him mid-breath, his eyes fixed on something beyond the mountains, and the immediate threat was over. But as Jacob stood over the bodies scattered in the snow, he knew Morrison's final words carried truth. This victory was temporary somewhere in distant offices. Powerful men would learn of their agent's failure and plan new approaches to eliminate the witness who threatened their conspiracy. What do we do now? Bea asked, her voice small in the vast silence that followed violence. Jacob considered the question as he gathered weapons from the dead men, checking each carefully before adding them to his collection. Morrison's pocket watch, Thomas Harrison's pocket watch, lay glinting in the snow, and Jacob retrieved it with careful reverence. Evidence. Proof of the conspiracy that could protect Bea if placed in the right hands. Now we prepare, he said finally. These men found us once, which means others can too. We need to make sure we're ready when they come. Will there be more fighting? Jacob looked at his daughter, seeing both the child she was and the strong woman she would become. The violence had marked her. How could it not? But it hadn't broken her. If anything, she seemed more determined than before, as if facing evil. Directly had somehow made her more certain of who she was and what she stood for. Maybe, he said honestly, but we'll face whatever comes together, as a family. Bea nodded solemnly and surprised him by picking up the music box that had fallen from her pocket during the fight. It was a small thing, carved from pine, like the wooden horse he'd given her, with a simple melody that Emma had hummed to Lucy years ago. She wound it carefully and set it playing, the gentle notes floating across the blood-stained snow like a prayer for the innocent dead. For her parents and little brother, for all the families Morrison and his partners had destroyed, for the children who would never grow up because of men's greed. They can't take our music, Bea said quietly, using words her mother had spoken during their darkest moments on the trail. They can't take our love or our memories or our hope. Those things live in here. She pressed her hand to her heart, where bullets can't reach. Jacob felt tears threaten for the first time in 20 years. Not from grief, but from overwhelming pride in this remarkable child who had somehow emerged from horror with her humanity intact. As the music box played its simple melody and snow began to fall again, covering the evidence of violence with pressed-on white, Jacob made a silent promise to his daughter and to the memory of her parents. Let them come. Let the powerful and corrupt send their killers and their threats. He'd spent 20 years preparing for this battle without knowing it, and now he had something worth fighting for again. They'd chosen the wrong mountain man to threaten, and they'd definitely chosen the wrong little girl. Spring came to the Wyoming mountains like a benediction. melting the snow that had held Jacob and Bee in their crystalline world through the long winter months. The pass opened gradually, revealing a landscape transformed by warmth and the promise of new beginnings. But the two people who emerged from that mountain sanctuary were not the same ones who had entered it. The legal proceedings took months to resolve. Jacob's trip to the territorial capital with Morrison's pocket watch and the documents he'd taken from the dead men created ripples that spread far beyond Wyoming territory. The conspiracy Morrison had boasted about proved real and extensive, reaching into mining corporations, territorial governments, and even certain federal offices in Washington. Thomas Harrison's murder hadn't been random violence. It had been a carefully planned assassination to prevent his territorial surveys from interfering with illegal mining claims. The $20,000 in government gold had been secondary to the information he'd carried about mineral rights and federal land grants. When the smoke cleared, 3 senators had resigned, a territorial governor faced federal charges, and the mining syndicate behind the killings found their assets frozen by federal marshals. More importantly for Jacob and Bee, the legal system recognized their unique family arrangement and granted Jacob official guardianship of the girl who'd already claimed his heart. "It's official now," Jacob told Bee as they sat on their porch. One evening in late spring, watching the sun set behind peaks that no longer seemed like barriers, but like guardians protecting their home. "I was already yours," Bee replied with the simple certainty of childhood. "The papers just make it so. Everyone else knows too." In her lap, she cradled a new drawing, not a map this time, but a family portrait. 2 figures stood before a mountain cabin, surrounded by the wildlife and wilderness they'd learned to call home. But in the background, rendered in gentle strokes, were 4 other figures: Emma and Lucy, Thomas and Mary Harrison. Not gone, but transformed, their love continuing in the family they'd helped create. "Do you think they approve?" Bee asked, following Jacob's gaze to the drawing. Jacob considered the question seriously. Emma had always believed in second chances and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. Thomas Harrison had died protecting his family's future. Surely he would understand Jacob's fierce dedication to his daughter's safety and happiness. "I think they're proud of us," Jacob said finally. "Proud of what we've built together." The cabin had changed over the months since winter's end. Jacob had added a proper bedroom for Bee, complete with shelves for her growing collection of books and drawings. A vegetable garden flourished behind the house, tended by small hands that had learned to coax life from mountain soil. Most significantly, Jacob had begun taking on woodworking commissions from settlements in the valley below, creating furniture and tools that bore the mark of true craftsmanship. The isolation that had once defined his existence had given way to careful community. Families in the valley knew they could count on Jacob Winters for help in times of trouble, and his reputation as a man who'd faced down killers to protect his daughter only added to their respect. But perhaps the most significant change was in Jacob himself. The bitter hermit who'd hidden from the world for 20 years had been replaced by a man who understood that love, not safety, was the highest calling of the human heart. "Jacob?" Bee's voice carried the same careful tone she'd used at first. Morning when she'd asked if he was sorry, she'd come. "Yes, daughter. Are you happy?" The question would have been impossible to answer a year ago. Happiness had seemed like a luxury Jacob had forfeited through his failures, something reserved for people who hadn't lost everything that mattered. But now, sitting beside this remarkable child who'd somehow found the strength to love again after witnessing unthinkable horrors, Jacob discovered that happiness wasn't something you earned or deserved. It was something you chose, day by day, moment by moment, in small acts of courage and connection. "More than I ever thought possible," he said honestly. Bee smiled and leaned against his shoulder, her head fitting perfectly in the space beneath his chin. "Good. because I have something to tell you. Jacob tensed slightly, memories of dangerous revelations still fresh in his mind. What's that? I've been thinking about names. Names? Well, I'm a Winters now, officially. But I was thinking maybe I could be Beatrice Winters Harrison. To remember where I came from, but also to celebrate where I am now. Jacob felt his throat tighten with emotion. Even at 8 years old, they understood the importance of honoring the past while embracing the future. She wasn't trying to replace her lost family. She was creating a bridge between her old life and her new one. I think that's perfect, he managed to say. Beatrice Winters Harrison, it is. As full darkness settled over their mountain home, Jacob carried his sleeping daughter inside and tucked her into the bed he built with his own hands. The wooden horse, Hope, sat on her knit stand beside her mother's torn piece of calico and her father's pocket watch, now returned to its rightful owner. Before blowing out the lamp, Jacob paused at his own dresser to look at the new photograph sitting beside Emma's picture. It showed him and Bea on the day the legal proceedings had concluded, both of them smiling despite their formal courtroom attire. The photographer had caught something precious in that image. Not just two people posing for a picture, but a real family, chosen and cherished and fought for. Later, as Jacob sat by the dying fire with his evening pipe, he reflected on the strange paths that life could take. A year ago, he'd been a bitter recluse counting down the days until death claimed him. Tonight, he was planning Bea's education, considering which books to order from back east. Thinking about the future with something approaching excitement. The girl who'd whispered, "Please, don't hurt me." That cold morning had somehow healed wounds Jacob hadn't even known were still bleeding. In teaching her to survive in his mountain world, he'd rediscovered what it meant to truly live. A soft sound from Bea's room drew his attention, not distress, but the gentle murmur of someone talking in their sleep. Jacob moved quietly to her doorway and listened to fragments of a dream conversation with parents she still missed, but no longer grieved as an open wound. "I'm safe, Mama," she whispered to the darkness. "Jacob takes good care of me. You'd like him. He tells stories almost as good as Papa did." Jacob smiled and returned to his chair, understanding finally that love wasn't a finite resource that could be exhausted or used up. The love he felt for Emma and Lucy hadn't diminished to make room for Bea. It had expanded, grown deeper and stronger, creating space for new joy without diminishing old devotion. Outside, the mountain wind sang its eternal song through the peaks. But inside the cabin, peace reigned. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, new opportunities for growth and connection. There might even be new threats. Jacob harbored no illusions that all of Morrison's employers had been caught or that their victory was complete. But whatever came, they would face it together, as a family, as people who had learned that the antidote to life's cruelest blows wasn't isolation or bitterness, but the radical act of choosing to love again. The fire burned low, casting gentle shadows on the walls of a home that had become a sanctuary not through solitude, but through the simple miracle of two broken souls learning to heal each other. And in the morning, when Bea woke to find fresh snow dusting the peaks and spring flowers blooming in the valley below, she would begin another day secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged, in the care of a man who would move mountains to keep her safe, and who had taught her that family wasn't just about blood, but about the promises people made to protect and cherish each other. The little girl who had once stolen bread to survive had found something far more precious than food. She had found home.